José Ruiz y Blasco, Pablo Picasso's father, takes his then 13-year-old son to a brothel for the first time. And although we're not really going to go into detail here about Picasso's exploits, it's safe to say that the women in his life would inspire some of his strongest work. Just look at his portraits of Dora Maar, or Françoise Gillot, or Jacqueline Roch. But this grouping isn't limited to wives and mistresses. Picasso notoriously derived inspiration from everywhere, from patrons and strangers to sex workers. Which brings us to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, painted in 1907, just 13 years after his introduction to the world of sex work. Les Demoiselles has been hailed as an icon of modern art and an affront to good sense. Equal parts brilliant and troubling, incendiary and confusing, this painting merits close, direct analysis. What you're seeing here is the legendary Spanish painter's depiction of 5 naked women, sex workers from a well-known brothel on Carrer d'Avignon, which is Catalan for Avignon Street, in Barcelona, where the artist lived at the time. Granted, the subject isn't exactly revolutionary. Jean-Auguste Dominicain did it in 1814 with Grande Odalisque, Edouard Manet famously with Olympia, and Edgar Degas too in his brothel monotypes, to name a few. What is new, however, is how Picasso handles it. Unlike the paintings we've seen, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is highly disconcerting. For starters, we don't understand where exactly these women are. Picasso tells us in the title their location, but this specificity is belied by the lack of any discernible reality surrounding them. The demoiselles, or young ladies, in this painting occupy an incomprehensible, frankly unreadable, geometric space. We have no real sense of depth or dimension, and a bowl of fruit at the base of the painting definitively separates their world from ours. When we look at this painting, what we're actually seeing are jagged, fragmented bodies displayed as if behind a glass case aggressively, in a space which only serves to underline their angularity, or one that disembodies the displayed bodies. Yet, unlike the women of Ingres, Manet, or even Matisse with their soft, fleshy curves, Picasso's demoiselles are hard, angular, and strong, aggressive even. Like Manet's Olympia, a few of Picasso's women stare directly, read confrontationally out at the viewer. However, unlike Olympia, lying in a bed surrounded by sumptuous materials and flowers, here there is little trace of sex appeal. In their clear-eyed, aggressive posturing, it is obvious that these women are aware of the artist's and the viewer's gaze. To some extent, they may even expect it, yet they do not give themselves away. This is no inviting maja desnuda. Instead, we are met with expertly crafted masks and exaggerated poses, too exaggerated to be mistaken for anything but artifice. The elbows jut upwards into space, while the faces are half contorted beyond recognition, half impassive, illegible. But perhaps the best way to get to grips with this painting is by exploring these figures individually, left to right. We see the first figure in profile. She faces the group and directs our gaze bodily to the frieze-like scene unfolding before us. Her foot is also seen from the side, consistent with early Egyptian art. Picasso was influenced extensively by various artistic styles, some of which can be seen in this work. But back to the figure. A strange hand emerges from the space just above her head and seems to reach for something beyond the canvas. Indeed, hands, disembodied, twisted, or reaching, figure prominently in much of Picasso's work, from Girl on the Ball to later Girl Before a Mirror, and several times in his masterpiece Guernica. In Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the unnaturalness of the hand almost begs the question, whose is it? Are options the first figures or no one's? And if it is her hand, why does it look so unnatural? The back of the hand faces out toward us. We can see the nails. So is this unnaturalness down to a sense of display, the effortful twisting and contorting of the female nude under the male artist's gaze, or something else entirely? As with much of Picasso's work, ambiguity is the watchword. We may never know definitively, but it is fun to explore different interpretations. The next two figures seem to be a group within the group. They are both covered to some extent by white sheets. Both have their arms above their heads and are quite consciously posing. The body of the first of the two is a complex of stark geometries. Her torso is an hourglass, her groin a triangle, her armpit a perfect V, the visual antithesis to her elbow, which forms an inverted V above her head. The second figure in this grouping is more columnar and takes the first's pose a step further by placing both arms above her head. Like the first figure, her eyes stare, they do not flirt. Her mouth is a simple line, a dash, communicating nothing. There is aggression in the stare, in her posture, in the jagged angularity of the bodies, but there is no desire on the woman's part to be comprehended. Indeed, Picasso's demoiselles seem to actively resist comprehension. Their staring eyes confront, refusing the expectation of visual pleasure. They know they are on display, they know you're looking at them, and they are looking at you too. You cannot get too comfortable. The last two figures are separated visually from the others by a blue background, and for good reason. For one thing, their faces are more objectively mask-like than the others. We see the influence of fang masks, especially in the standing figure. Later an avid collector of African art, Picasso was profoundly influenced by African masks, as is clear in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Describing a visit to the now Musée du Quai Branly, Picasso says, "But I forced myself to stay, to examine these masks, all these objects that people had created with a sacred, magical purpose, to serve as intermediaries between them and the unknown, hostile forces surrounding them, attempting in that way to overcome their fears by giving them color and form." And then I understood what painting really meant. It's not an aesthetic process, it's a form of magic that interposes itself between us and the hostile universe, a means of seizing power by imposing form on our terrors as well as on our desires. The day I understood that, I had found my path. It is clear from his language that for Picasso, these masks were not objects of pure visual pleasure. He has to force himself to stay. It is an act of will. Moreover, he is aware that this art and its removal from the European tradition is the product of another consciousness, another set of facts, which produces different insights, different solutions. Furthermore, according to Picasso, the masks weren't just like any other pieces of sculpture, not at all. They were magic things, mediators. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon must have come to me that day. But mediating what? Did Picasso give the sex workers mask-like faces in an attempt to render whatever fear he had of them, whatever power they held over him, or his own desire, more manageable? Or is the mask intended to separate the sex worker from the viewer, the client, the artist, to protect the self from unknown hostile forces and retain one sense of agency, of power? Again, it's open to interpretation. Returning to our subject, the figure in the foreground is seated, a pink body in three-quarter view, blending into itself with a twisted head. One gets the sense that she has turned to confront the viewer and is not at all happy about what she sees. We might read displeasure in her eyebrows, and her mouth is slightly ajar. Yet she too poses. Her hands rest gently at an angle against her back. She almost takes the shape of a vase as we see the arms positioned at either side like handles. The final figure, bookending the frieze, seems to occupy her own niche, almost. Her arms disappear behind folds of blue. Could it be a curtain? Like the first woman, she looks at the group, not at us. Has she also stumbled in upon this scene? In her positioning, the direction of her gaze and body, she takes us back into the picture. And what we find there is fear, alienation, and an abiding sense of alterity. In Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, we see the seed of cubism, of modernist fragmentation. There is a lack of coherence. The space itself is illegible. Where are we? Well, the brothel on Avignon Street, of course, but what is that? Why is everything so close together, so compressed? There's no room to breathe, no space. It is a secret place, a space of disclosures, but within it one doesn't feel secure, but rather disoriented and dislocated, like the hand above the first woman. And what about the fruit? The still life of grapes, apples, and a slice of melon at the center of the base of the frame. Like much of Picasso's work, it might mean anything. One might read it as a crude allusion to fecundity, as the apple of knowledge, here fleshly, of sin. In initial drafts the group was eating. Is it meant to underline the sensuality or delectableness of the painting? Likely not. It is clear that this is two-dimensional gestural fruit. It is a painting. There's no pretension to reality here. And can we talk about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon without addressing the colonialist or feminist subtext, the fundamental alterity which has been built into the canvas? After all, this is a painting about the other, involving so-called primitive art and women. Both fall under the artist's colonizing brush. Perhaps both, depending on your reading, are restored or somehow empowered under it. Perhaps not. And what, in the end? A fundamental break with artistic tradition. 5 naked women arranged around a bowl of fruit. So what are your thoughts on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon? Let us know in the comments.